thank you so much for having me. As Jenna mentioned, I work at the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network. I have been with the organization for 9.5 years, so have been started talking to patients and caregivers actually on our Patient Central Call Center, where we field over 14,000 new calls and emails every year. And so really started there providing resources to pancreatic cancer patients and their loved ones. And a lot of those conversations were around clinical trials. And now much of my time is spent actually overseeing our database and then just educating our team and people that I come across about clinical trials and what they are and how they can get involved. So just for today, I wanted to give you an overview of what I'm going to go over. So first, we'll start off with some clinical trial basics, such as what are clinical trials, how are they designed, how is safety monitored in clinical trials? I know that that is a concern for many caregivers and patients. I'll also go through some clinical trial myths and fears, cover some clinical trial eligibility pieces, and then also finally end on finding how you can find clinical trials. So first off, to start with some basics. So what are clinical trials? We get this question all the time, and they are research studies that are testing new treatments and screening or prevention tools for a particular disease, in this case, of course, pancreatic cancer. And they're important for the development of new treatment options and screening tools for patients with pancreatic cancer. So for patients, clinical trials are really an option that allows patients to have access to experimental treatments before they're available in the clinic. So a lot of times patients participate because there's a promising treatment being studied in a clinical trial that they want access to before they could get it in the clinic from their prescribing doctor. And really, clinical trials exist because they're necessary to determine if those new experimental treatments or screening tools that are developed in the laboratory by researchers are actually safe and beneficial to people living with a disease such as pancreatic cancer. So sometimes the treatments will work well in the laboratory or even in mice models, but then we need to actually make sure that they work and that they're safe for people. And really, PanCan has taken the stance since 2010 that pancreatic cancer patients should be considering clinical trials at diagnosis and during every treatment decision. And definitely many of the other World Pancreatic Cancer Coalition organizations have also really resonated the importance of clinical trials for patients with pancreatic cancer. So I wanted to walk through first the different phases of clinical trials. And I also wanted to say, feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to field questions as we go along. So first off, the different phases of clinical trials. So when a new experimental treatment has been found to have some efficacy in the lab or some sign that it may work for pancreatic cancer, the researchers actually first need to determine if the treatment is actually safe for humans. They've done a little bit of work, so they have an idea of what to anticipate. And so they'll put this trial in this drug in a phase 1 trial, which is where the researchers are starting to look at what appropriate dose would be for patients, as well as monitor the side effects of the treatment. And this is usually done in a very small group of patients, so usually anywhere from 20 to 40 patients. And really the main question that researchers are wanting to answer is this treatment safe? What side effects are patients experiencing? How can we manage those side effects? What dose can we use safely for patients so that those side effects don't outweigh the benefits of the drug? So that's what happens in a phase 1. And once a drug gets through a phase 1 and the researchers say, yes, this is safe, let's see how well it's working in a larger group of patients. So it will move on to a phase 2 trial. And in phase 2 trials, these are usually specific to a specific disease, so in this case, pancreatic cancer, and they're looking to see how effective the treatment is. So is it causing patients' tumors to shrink? Is it causing their tumors to remain stable and not progress? And they'll look at that by monitoring different tumor markers as well as scans. So patients might get CT scans to actually measure how well the treatment is working. And so in this particular phase, they're usually studying up to 100 patients, so it's a slightly larger population. And the question that's being answered is, does it work? So are the researchers seeing patients that are benefiting from this particular treatment? And then once they have a signal in the phase 2 trial that it is working, the drug will move on to a phase 3 trial. And in phase 3 trials, that's really where the main purpose is to determine if this new experimental treatment is any better than the standard of care that already exists for a disease. So for pancreatic cancer, the standard of care in the US and several countries is either gemcitabine plus Abraxane or modified FOLFIRINOX. So those are the two standard of cares currently for metastatic pancreatic cancer or cancer that is spread to other organs. And that particular drug would be compared to the experimental treatment. And so the question being answered in these very large trials, usually up to 1,000 patients, is this new experimental treatment better than the standard of care treatment? And so it's just the basic of the phases. And there are a number of clinical trial designs. So when trials are designed, they obviously want to answer these specific questions in each of these different phases. And so the trials will go about that in a number of different ways. So researchers will often determine the number of arms or treatment groups that are needed in the trial, depending on the design of the trial. So for those phase 1 trials that I just mentioned, those are usually what are called single-arm trials, where the researchers are only studying one particular treatment at a time. So they're only looking at one new experimental treatment and seeing how that works. There are also trials with multiple arms. Oftentimes, those are those phase 2. More likely, they're the phase 3 trials where the researchers are actually comparing two groups of patients. One group of patients who is receiving that standard of care drug for pancreatic cancer, and the other group of patients who are receiving the experimental treatment. So that's a little bit about the number of arms. There's also blinding. When there are a number of arms in a clinical trial, sometimes the trials are designed to help eliminate any bias that your loved one's doctor may have or even your loved one may have towards a particular treatment. So for double-blind trials, those are trials where your loved one's doctor, as well as your loved one and yourself, no one will know what treatment the patient is on. And that's really to make sure that there's no bias from the doctor or from the patient as to how they think they should be responding to the trial and the drug. There's also single blind trials where
join the meeting,
or the patient who is participating in the trial won't know what treatment they're on, you won't know what treatment they're on, but the doctor and the research team will know the treatment that they're on. And then finally, there are open label trials, and those are clinical trials where both your loved one, you, and the researchers and the doctor will know which treatment the patient is receiving. And oftentimes in clinical trials with multiple arms, patients are randomized, meaning that as your loved one enrolls in the trial, they'll be randomly assigned to different arms. So basically that's very simply a coin toss, but very complicated. A computer is assigning patients to different arms at random so that there's no bias into putting patients on different arms, so that the doctor isn't saying, I'm only going to put the healthy patients on this arm and I'm only going to put the less healthy patients on this arm. So that's where randomization comes in, so that that particular bias is taken away and that the trial can actually determine if the experimental treatment that's being studied is working. And I just wanted to touch briefly, because the landscape of clinical trials are changing. It used to be very simply that there were phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, and that still very much is the case. And the trials used to be extremely simple. But now, as we're learning more about cancer, including pancreatic cancer, and learning that even two different patients with pancreatic cancer, they have a completely different molecular makeup, or the DNA of their tumor may be completely different. There are now new clinical trials designs that are coming out and really allowing us to study cancer in a different way. So there are basket trials, which these trials are designed for one experimental drug to be studied in a particular mutation, but across any tumor type. So, for example, a basket trial may include pancreatic cancer patients, lung cancer patients, breast cancer patients, colon cancer patients that all have the same mutation in their tumor. And then there are umbrella trials that are actually studying multiple different drugs, and then the patients that are coming into the trial are actually assigned to one of those drugs or one of those arms based on the type of cancer they have, as well as the mutation that they have in their cancer. And then finally, there are platform trials, which are usually in one specific cancer type. So of course, in this case, pancreatic cancer. And these platform trials are actually studying multiple drugs at a time. And they actually use statistical analysis to determine when new drugs can come on the trial, and then when the drugs that are currently being studied on the trial aren't working well for patients, and when those should come off. So those are just 3 new areas of clinical trial design that you'll probably see more and more. In the U.S., we have the National Cancer Institute MATCH trial is an example of one of these emerging clinical trial designs, where it's studying multiple types of drugs across multiple cancer types and really classifying patients based on their mutation. So that's an example of an umbrella trial. I also wanted to touch on clinical trial endpoints. So there's always a lot of questions around why are we doing clinical trials? Why do we need to do clinical trials, and what are clinical trials looking at? And so each of the different phases look at different things, but each of the trials, when they're designed, have clinical endpoints or specific measures that the team is looking at to determine if the clinical trial, basically what its impact is. And that's all designed in the clinical trial protocol, which I'll touch on in just a moment. And so some of those endpoints may include efficacy, or how well the treatment is working. So oftentimes this is measured in progression-free survival. So how many months a patient is on treatment that their disease doesn't progress. Also, quality of life is a measure. So oftentimes, and this is a really great addition to a lot of clinical trials now, that they're actually including patient questionnaires to be able to address your loved one's quality of life, determining how active they are each day, if there's any changes to their activity, really just how they're doing and how they're feeling on the trial. So there's a lot of quality of life measures now in many clinical trials that are being designed. And then also toxicity is another endpoint. So in those phase 1 clinical trials, obviously it's very important to know what the side effects are of the treatment. And so toxicity is measuring those side effects. And clinical trials will have specific measures that they have to meet in those phase 1 trials in regards to toxicity and side effects before they can move on to a phase 2 trial. And then finally, before we get into a little bit about eligibility and myths, I wanted to touch on safety in clinical trials. So many patients, caregivers call and ask, how do I know that my loved one will be safe in a clinical trial? And that's absolutely a great question, because there's been a lot of, in the very not so far past, there have been some research studies that were a little bit questionable in how they were designed, and it was before all of these safety procedures were put in place. So now all clinical trials have to have a protocol, and that protocol needs to outline why the study is safe, what is the justification for studying this experimental treatment in this particular patient population, and also what is the design and how is that going to answer the research question. So really the clinical trial protocols are what the researchers write up to show to the institutional review board, which I'll talk about in a minute, that actually they can say, okay, here's our plan, essentially poke holes on it, make sure that we are doing what we need to be doing to make sure that we are ensuring that these patients are safe and that we can actually answer a question that these patients and their families are donating their time to be part of this clinical trial. There's also the informed consent, which is usually a very long, very legal-looking form that really lays out all of the reasoning behind the trial, and it ensures that your loved one who's participating in the trial is actually given complete information about the clinical trial prior to participating. So informed consent forms really contain all of the risks and benefits that the research team feels that a patient participating on the trial may incur. There's a description of all of the procedure requirements, so how often the patient will be required to come into the site for the clinical trial, what tests will be done, those types of things. There's also a notification that a patient can withdraw at any time from a clinical trial, and there's information on how that happens. And then this informed consent actually must be signed in the clinic by your loved one, the patient participating in the clinical trial, and the research nurse is there to answer any questions the patient has about the informed consent and the trial. And then another level of safety review is the Institutional Review Board in the United States. In other companies, it may be called an ethics committee or a human research ethics committee. And so those groups basically are responsible for reviewing and monitoring clinical trials to ensure that participants, such as your loved ones who are participating in clinical trials, are exposed to minimum risk, and that those risks that they are exposed to are reasonable in relation to the expected benefits from the treatment. So basically outlining, they're looking to see if the expected side effects from participating in the clinical trial are reasonable compared to the benefits, so essentially the expected survival on the trial. And then finally, there's the Data Safety Monitoring Board or the Data Monitoring Committee, depending on which country you're in, and there's probably a few other names that I've missed. But those groups monitor any of the health-related problems, such as side effects that are in clinical trials called adverse events. And this particular group analyzes the safety, and they also can look at the efficacy or how well the treatment is working before the trial completes. So they're constantly monitoring the data that's coming out of the trial, and this is the group that actually has the ability to say before the trial has enrolled all of the patients that it's looking for, to say, hey, this treatment actually is not on target to be more effective or to meet its endpoints. Those clinical endpoints, or there's those specific measures that were outlined in the protocol, and they can actually stop the trial and say it's not beneficial to patients to be able to be on this trial, so we're going to stop future enrollment. So into clinical trial eligibility. So many patients who call us, many caregivers who call us really ask, how does a patient get on a trial? Why are there some patients that can go on a trial and some patients that just can't? So that really comes down to eligibility criteria. So in addition to all of those different committees and protocols and informed consents that are put in place for clinical trials, another piece of safety measure in clinical trials is actually eligibility criteria. So there are two main purposes for eligibility criteria. One is to identify a patient population with enough in common to be able to determine whether or not the treatment helped. So, for example, in pancreatic cancer, patients who have early stage disease that is able to be removed by surgery may respond completely differently from someone who has been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that isn't able to have surgery or that the disease has spread outside the pancreas. So when eligibility criteria is being formed, they want to make sure not to pool those groups together, because that will essentially muddy the data that's being collected, and the researchers may not be able to answer the question of if this treatment is going to work for these patients. So they really want to put together eligibility criteria to identify the specific patient population that they feel will benefit from the treatment. The second reason that eligibility criteria is determined really is to protect patients and to ensure that any pre-existing or coexisting medical conditions that the patient may have really don't put the patient at risk on the trial. So, for example, if there are serious medical conditions that a patient currently has in addition to their pancreatic cancer, that might be a reason based on what the researchers know about the drug that's being studied that a patient might be actually excluded from a trial. So, for example, if there is an experimental drug that's being studied that's known to have cardiac side effects or heart side effects, this is an extreme case, but if that is the case, then they will likely exclude patients who have history of cardiac events. So that's definitely one reason why eligibility criteria is put together. And then also, just wanted to touch on some of the standard eligibility criteria. So type and stage of cancer is one eligibility criteria. And again, that's usually there to identify the patient population who has enough in common to determine if the new experimental treatment is working. Prior treatments received is also an eligibility criteria that is in pretty much every clinical trial. So they often want to know which treatments a patient has previously had, because, for example, if the patient recently had gemcitabine and Abraxane and their disease didn't respond to that treatment, and the new clinical trial, the experimental treatment, is combined with gemcitabine or Abraxane, they may exclude those patients who've already received either of those drugs because they don't expect that that patient will actually respond to that treatment because they previously had not responded. So it's also an ethical piece there to make sure that we're not giving the same treatment to a patient who already received those treatments and that the treatment had previously failed the patient. Age is also a standard requirement that is changing a little bit. So luckily, especially for pancreatic cancer, many clinical trials are starting to remove the upper age limit because a lot of patients who are diagnosed are above 70, which sometimes is the upper age range cutoff for clinical trials. Eligibility criteria will also look at medical history. So again, looking at those coexisting medical conditions such as heart disease, kidney function, liver function, just making sure kind of how the patient medically has done. And then also current medical conditions. So they're looking at any treatments that the patient is on either for their cancer or for other conditions that they have. And they're also looking at a patient's performance status. So generally, clinical trials will require that patients have a good performance status, which basically means that they are able to carry out regular activities, that they aren't bedridden, those types of things. But there are a number of clinical trials now that are being designed specifically in pancreatic cancer that I've seen that are looking for patients who have the poorer performance status, because sometimes, I mean, we all know that those patients are out there and we want to know how we can best treat those patients, because a lot of the treatments that are currently available were studied in patients who had a better performance status. So there's definitely research and clinical trials out there to see how best to treat patients who have a worse performance status. All right, so I'm going to go into a few myths and fears that we hear consistently every day on the phones with patients and caregivers, and we will bust some myths today. So first, oftentimes we have patients, caregivers call that say that they are afraid that their loved one may receive a placebo instead of treatment on a clinical trial. So this is actually a myth. So the fact is that patients will always receive either the new treatment, so that new experimental treatment, or the best known current treatment. So sometimes a placebo or a sugar pill is given in clinical trials, and when it is given, it's given in addition to the best known treatment as a way of blinding the trial. So as I mentioned previously, there are some clinical trials where They're double-blinded, meaning they don't want to include bias from the patient or the healthcare professional on how the drug is doing. So they will oftentimes essentially prescribe a placebo that makes it impossible for the physician and the patient to understand which treatment the patient is on. But when placebos are given, they're always given in combination with the best standard of care. So, for example, on a phase 3 trial where a experimental treatment is being studied in addition to gemcitabine and Abraxane, that would be the experimental arm, where it would be the experimental treatment, gemcitabine and Abraxane that the patient is receiving. And then the control arm would actually be a placebo plus gemcitabine plus Abraxane. So there's not going to be a case in a cancer clinical trial where a patient isn't receiving the standard of care. Patients will always receive some type of treatment if there's a standard of care for the disease. On to the next myth. So clinical trials cost more than regular treatment. So this is something that we hear every day, and the fact is that the trial sponsor or a patient's insurance company, healthcare system should cover medical costs. So this definitely does vary from trial to trial and likely varies from country to country as well, but there are two different types of costs in a clinical trial. One is the research costs, which are the costs that the patient will incur because they are on the cost that happens because the patient is on the trial. So that experimental treatment, any extra scans that the patient needs to receive, those types of things are all covered by the trial sponsor in most cases. The other costs are the routine care costs. So those are costs that the patient insurance company would incur if the patient was on a trial or outside of a trial. And a lot of the times now with new regulations, the insurance companies actually cover those standard of care costs. So aside from insurance copays and of course transportation to the trial site, sometimes there's obviously costs associated with traveling to the trial site. There shouldn't be costs outside of what's normal with the standard of care. So a few more myths. So we hear that from caregivers that they feel their loved one will be treated like a guinea pig on a clinical trial. And the fact is that patients and their caregivers really are the heart and soul of clinical trials. So clinical trials can't be done without patients. Patients are really the reason that the clinical trials are being conducted and the reason that we have the treatments that we have today. So your loved one's participation is extremely important, and there are several safety measures put in place in clinical trials to make sure that the patients understand what is going on in the trial, that their caregivers understand, and that they know who to contact if there are any side effects that happen and kind of what that routine is. So definitely not treated as guinea pigs, definitely a very important part of the clinical trials process, and clinical trials would be impossible to be done without patients and their caregivers. We also hear people say that clinical trials are only appropriate for people who have exhausted all of their standard of care treatment options. So the fact is that this is actually changing. So clinical trials can provide access to promising treatments that may be more effective than the standard approach. And there has been a great shift in the pancreatic cancer clinical trial space over the last few years, where there are actually more and more clinical trials that are available for patients who have not started standard of care. So we have 2 standards of care treatments currently available, but there are a number of clinical trials out there for patients in any portion of their journey. So if they haven't started treatment, there are clinical trials. If they started one treatment and unfortunately that treatment has failed them, there are clinical trials for those people. There are also clinical trials for people who have had 2 or 3 treatments fail them. So there definitely are options out there in the clinical trial space. We also hear from caregivers that they feel their loved one won't have access to the experimental treatment once the clinical trial ends, even if that treatment is working for their loved one. And the fact is that patients actually can continue on the experimental treatment even if the trial ends, as long as it's working for that patient, or until the experimental treatment is approved and becomes available through regular channels. So there are actually a number of clinical trials that overall fail to meet their endpoints, but there are oftentimes patients on those trials who actually greatly benefit from the treatment. So even though the trial has shown not to be effective for a large population, there are some patients that a particular treatment is effective for, and many of the trial sponsors will continue to provide that treatment to that patient until that patient, until that treatment is no longer working for that patient. So there definitely are systems in place to make sure if a patient is benefiting from an experimental treatment, that that experimental treatment is available to them. One more myth that we often hear is caregivers are concerned and patients are concerned that the quality of life will be less on a clinical trial than on standard of care. And this is actually, the fact is that patients on clinical trials are actually monitored very closely by the clinical trial team, and those protocols that I mentioned earlier are in place to monitor the side effects and provide treatment for any side effects that occur. So one very interesting thing that we often hear from patients and their caregivers is patients don't want to be on a randomized trial where they're just going to get the standard of care. But the great thing about clinical trials is patients are often being seen at institutions that are seeing a high volume of pancreatic cancer. They obviously have a clinical trial in pancreatic cancer, and they have a dedicated team that's available to provide care and monitor these patients very closely. So oftentimes the attentiveness and the care received on the clinical trial is actually slightly higher than a care received just in the clinic. And one last myth, my loved one won't be able to drop out of the trial after they start. So the fact is that patients are actually able to stop treatment on a trial at any time and for any reason. So if a patient just isn't feeling well on the trial, if the side effects become unmanageable and the care team has done everything they can, but the patient doesn't want to continue participating on the trial, the patient has every right to stop the trial, to remove their consent that they provided at informed consent, and to go on to a different treatment. So oftentimes patients are afraid to be in clinical trials because they think once they sign up they can't leave, but they absolutely can. It's a very personal decision to determine if your loved one wants to participate in a clinical trial, and it's absolutely their right to determine that they don't want to participate in a clinical trial anymore. So I touched on many of these as we were going through the myths and the facts, but here are some benefits of clinical trials. So clinical trial participants, your loved ones, receive very close monitoring and care, as well as support by a research team who understands pancreatic cancer. It also allows your loved one to take a more active role in their health care, being able to have conversations about what treatment options they may want to have, including clinical trials. It also provides your loved one access to experimental treatments that may be more effective before they're widely available to the general population. Your loved one also may be among the first to benefit if the experimental treatment is found to be helpful. Also, it's a very important contribution that your loved one is making to research. It really may not only help them and provide better quality of life and quantity of life, but it may also help other people who have the same illness in the future. And then, of course, as I just mentioned, your loved one can back out of the clinical trial at any time. So I know that was a lot of information. I'm going to give you a little bit more on finding a clinical trial. So now that you kind of have a basis of what trials are, what the eligibility criteria is, and some of the facts around clinical trials, I wanted to share how you can find one. So here is a map that I actually took just a few months ago of the clinical trials that are currently recruiting patients with pancreatic cancer throughout the world. So you can see there's probably, if I do quick math, around 550 clinical trials throughout the world that are available to patients with pancreatic cancer. And so how do you find those? One way is patient advocacy groups. So organizations such as Craig's Cause and CanCan and a number of the other World Pancreatic Cancer Coalition members throughout the world actually have resources to be able to help find clinical trials or to be able to direct you and your loved ones to be able to find clinical trials. They can also answer any questions you have about clinical trials, provide resources, help kind of just calm your fears and answer any questions that you or your loved one have about clinical trials. Healthcare providers are also a great resource. They obviously know about the clinical trials taking place in their particular institution, and then a lot of healthcare providers also travel to conferences throughout the year, and they learn about other clinical trials. So they are also a great resource in helping you find clinical trials if you and your loved one are interested in those. Support groups are also a way. So oftentimes we hear that patients and their caregivers actually learn about clinical trials from somebody else who is on a clinical trial. So that's definitely one way to find out about clinical trials as well. And then industry websites. So the pharmaceutical industry, biotech industry, obviously a lot of the clinical trials that are out there are run by industry. So industry websites is another way to find clinical trials if you're interested in a specific drug that you may be aware of. And then there's also a lot of online clinical trial finders and clinical trial listings. So PanCan actually does have a clinical trial finder. We maintain a list of clinical trials in the US as well as some in Canada. We don't have anything outside the US and Canada right now, but our patient central staff is available to use some of these other tools such as trials.cancer.gov, clinicaltrials.gov, canadiancancertrials.ca, etc., to be able to find clinical trials in your area. So there definitely are a number of resources out there to help you find clinical trials for your loved one. And then I just briefly wanted to go over the clinical trial process just to kind of give you a bird's eye view of once you find a clinical trial for your loved one and your loved one expresses interest, really what are those next steps? So the first step would be a patient referral to the site. So on those clinical trial listings and those clinical trial finders, oftentimes there will be contact information for a site, or your healthcare professional will likely also reach out to a site and let them know that there is a patient that's interested in participating in a clinical trial. The site then evaluates the patient to determine if they're eligible based on their medical history, et cetera, matched up to the eligibility criteria for the clinical trial. The patient would then need to go into the clinic, and oftentimes this is a great time for the caregiver to accompany them as well. Of course, the caregiver is very much involved in patient care and support. So the informed consent process, as I discussed, happens in the clinic, and the clinical trial team will go over with the patient and the caregiver all of the different details of the clinical trial and answer any questions. Then once the patient has signed the informed consent, there's a screening period to do additional tests to determine if the patient still qualifies for the trial and also determine the baseline. So there'll often be scans of the tumor to see how what the size is to be able to measure efficacy in the trial. Then all of that is done and the patient is ultimately determined if they're eligible. So there are some things in that initial evaluation they can't get to that actually has to happen in the screening period, and then they'll determine if the patient is eligible for the clinical trial. The patient will then start treatment on a trial. There will be subsequent cycles, so oftentimes patients will need to visit a trial site usually once a week to participate in the trial, either to receive treatment or to receive scans. And then at some point the patient may end treatment, either the treatment stops working or the trial is actually ended in that the patient has received the amount of treatment that has been indicated on the protocol. And then at that point, there may be a new treatment initiation that could be in another clinical trial or outside of the clinical trial. And then also, all patients who are on a clinical trial do study follow-up. So even after they have stopped receiving treatment on the trial, the clinical trial site and the coordinators will often reach out to the patient to follow up with them, see how they're doing, and those types of things. So just to conclude, and thank you for your attention today, I just wanted to throw out a few bits of conclusion. So first of all, I think a big take-home message is that clinical trials may be a treatment option for your loved one and absolutely should be considered. Clinical trials can provide your loved one access to experimental therapies before they're available in the clinic and to other patients outside of clinical trials. Clinical trials are also designed to determine if experimental treatments or screening tools may benefit future patients. And it's important to talk to your loved one about their wishes for their treatment as well as their doctor about clinical trials. And really participating in a clinical trial is a personal decision that your loved one will need to make and very much with your support. And finally, just a little plug, I wanted to let you all know that January is Pancreatic Cancer Clinical Trials Awareness Month. And so the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network on our website, which is pancan.org, will have lots of information about clinical trials and the process, some more myth busting. So feel free to visit our website in the month of January to learn more about clinical trials and have more of your questions answered. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I am happy to take any questions that you have.